the heart of the Zarelian Empire, among stars that shimmered like distant memories. The Emperor's voice echoed across every major channel of communication. Princess Delixa is ready for union. It was meant to be a diplomatic triumph, a chance to bind ancient rival worlds through marriage. But behind the ceremonial fanfare hid a truth that turned every eager suitor away. Delixa was groundbound, born to a winged species where flight was status, mobility, and beauty. The princess's malformed wings had folded her into silence since childhood. Medical advances failed her. Tradition failed her worse. Still, the empire needed peace, and tradition demanded marriage. Dozens of noble houses from across the galaxy responded with interest, sending polished suitors dressed in silks and powered armor. They bowed, smiled, and fled when they saw her wings, small, still, and bent. One by one, they left. "A queen who cannot fly, cannot lead," muttered one ambassador. "She's beautiful, but incomplete," said another. The palace staff began to whisper that the proposal had become a curse. The media spun stories of tragedy. The emperor, usually stern and controlled, aged in weeks. Even Delixa, ever composed, stopped asking who had arrived each morning. Then, in a dusty corner of Sector K-29, an invitation reached the planet most considered unremarkable, Earth. There, in a cramped university office full of old alien books and snack wrappers, a human named Elias Trent blinked at the message glowing on his screen. "Marriage proposal," he said aloud, his voice cracking slightly, "to an alien princess." The others in the department laughed, assumed it was a scam or some weird prank. Elias, however, read every word. Not out of greed or fame, but curiosity. His mind raced with questions. Why her? Why him? Why now? And yet, as he reread her brief bio and studied the hologram portrait, he saw something no one else had noticed: eyes full of quiet defiance, a posture of dignity, not shame. Something stirred in him. Elias had spent years studying alien cultures, learning to read their gestures, listen between the lines. He was not a soldier, not royalty, not anyone special, just a human who understood language, empathy, and what it meant to be ignored. So he clicked accept across the galaxy. When news broke that a human had agreed to meet the disabled princess, confusion spread like wildfire. Publicity stunt, some scoffed. Humans are reckless, others said. The emperor's advisors argued against it, but the old man only said, "Let him come." When Elias arrived on the Zarelian homeworld, the contrast was painful. Tall, gleaming towers curved into violet skies. Zarelians floated, glided, soared above their cities like flocks of birds dressed in armor and silk. Elias walked. He looked upward a lot, stumbled a few times, laughed too loud, and wore a patched-up translator band and second-hand boots. No one cheered for him. No one offered a welcome. But he didn't mind. He was too busy wondering what kind of person Delixa truly was. Their first meeting was in a crystal garden, a place where gravity swirled lightly and the air shimmered. She stood at the far end, watching him approach like he might vanish. Her dress flowed like water, her silver hair pinned back, and her wings, he saw them immediately small, twisted at the joints, folded close to her back. But what struck Elias most were her eyes, sharp, tired, and prepared to be disappointed. He bowed clumsily. "Elias Trent," he said with a crooked grin. "Earth, Department of Xenolinguistics. Terrible at dancing, decent at chess." She blinked. Not the reaction she expected. "You came," she said softly. Her voice, like music, played underwater. "I did," he replied. It seemed rude not to. She tilted her head, studying him. "You don't pity me." "Why would I?" he said. "You're standing in front of me, and you haven't tried to run. That's more than most people do when they meet me." A breath caught in her throat, half a laugh. For the first time in years, she felt something other than bitterness during the suitor visit. They talked for over an hour about human rain and Zarelian storms, about music made from crystal leaves and poetry written on wind currents. Lias asked questions, never once looking at her wings, and she, slowly, began to answer. By the end of the meeting, when the royal guards came to escort Elias away, she said only one thing. Will you return tomorrow? He smiled. If I'm still invited. That night, as twin moons rose above the palace, whispers raced through the towers. The human didn't leave. He spoke to her without shame. He made her laugh, and in the quiet chamber, where the emperor stood watching the stars, a single line of hope entered his mind. Perhaps this one is different. Far away, Elias lay awake on his floating cot, staring at the ornate ceiling. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing. He had seen something in her eyes. Not weakness, not brokenness, but someone who had waited too long for someone to just see her, and he intended to look again. Elias Trent woke early the next morning, his mind full of questions he could not answer, his thoughts tangled with images of Princess Delixa, the way she had looked at him like he was either brave or foolish, maybe both, and how her voice had carried something deep, like sorrow kept in a sealed room for too long, now barely escaping through the cracks, and he wondered what kind of life she had lived. Being royalty, yet rejected by her own people, judged not for her words or her mind, but for the simple fact that her wings had never spread wide like the rest of her kind. And as he stepped out onto the floating corridors of the Zarelian palace, he felt eyes on him from every direction, guards watching, nobles whispering, servants glancing with thinly veiled curiosity, as if trying to understand why a simple human from a distant, ignored world would agree to meet the princess everyone else had turned away from. But Elias didn't let it bother him, because he wasn't here for fame or reward. He was here because something about the Delixa felt important, like a forgotten story begging to be read. And when he entered the crystal garden again, she was already there, sitting beside a pool of floating stones, her dress the color of sunrise, and her wings folded tight as ever. But there was a quiet calm in her expression that hadn't been there before, and when she saw him, she didn't speak at first, just watched him cross the garden, like someone unsure if a dream will vanish the moment they touch it, until finally she said, "You came back," and Elias, grinning as always, replied, "Of course, I still owe you a chess match." And that made her smile, just a little, and they sat down beside the pool, where gravity shimmered strangely, letting the stone pieces float between them as they began the game. But neither of them truly focused on winning, because their conversation moved faster than their hands. She asked about Earth, about rainstorms and oceans, and what it felt like to run without fear of falling. And he asked about her childhood, her lessons in court politics, the books she used to read when no one came to visit her. And though some questions made her pause, made her eyes turn away, as if remembering things too sharp to hold for long, she still answered, because Elias listened, not with pity, but with real interest, as if every word she said was something new and worth knowing. And time passed, unnoticed, until the sky shifted from violet to gold and palace bells rang in the distance, calling them back to the formal halls where masks and manners ruled again. And as Elias walked beside the Delixa down the corridor, he could feel the tension in the air, like the walls themselves were waiting for him to fail. But he kept his head high, and when they entered the council chamber filled with advisors and nobles, silence fell like a heavy curtain, because no one expected the human to last this long, and certainly not to be standing at the princess's side with such easy calm. And the emperor, sitting on his tall throne of silver branches, raised a hand and said, "Elias Trent, you were invited to consider a union, not to stay for pleasure." And though the words were stern, There was a flicker of interest in his ancient eyes, and Elias, sensing the test, stepped forward and bowed deeply, then said, "Your Majesty, I did not come for pleasure. I came because someone offered me a chance to know her. Not her title, not her image, just her. And I found someone worth knowing." And the room remained silent, some faces cold, others surprised, and Thalixa, standing just a step behind, spoke clearly for all to hear. "He is the first who looked at me without fear or false kindness. Okay, and I ask that he be allowed to stay." And those words, simple as they were, shook the room like a quiet storm. Because no one had heard the princess speak so firmly in years, and though the emperor gave no answer then, he waved his hand, and the meeting ended, and that night Elias found his quarters moved closer to hers. The gesture unspoken but clear. He was being watched, but also accepted. For now, and over the next days, the palace changed. Just a little, as whispers turned into stares, into quiet nods, and soon the media caught hold of the story, flashing headlines across systems. The human who said yes, groundbound princess finds unlikely match, alliance through the unexpected. And while many doubted the truth of their bond, others began to hope, for the galaxy had grown tired of war and distance, and maybe, just maybe, a human strange, stubborn kindness could change something deeper. And still, even as the public story grew, Elias and Thalixa continued their meetings away from cameras, learning each other's thoughts and flaws, their dreams and doubts, and she showed him parts of the palace that even nobles feared to enter. Dark libraries, ancient archives, forgotten gardens, grown wild without winged feet to land among them. And in return, Elias taught her human music, simple earth melodies that played on his handheld recorder, songs with stories about standing tall and being heard. And one evening, as they listened to a quiet earth lullaby, Thalixa said, "You know, they still expect you to leave." And Elias replied, "They may expect it, but I don't plan to." And she nodded slowly, but said nothing more. Her hand lingered on his arm longer than usual, and outside, far beyond the palace walls, the stars kept moving, and somewhere in that wide, ancient galaxy, a spark had been lit that none of them yet understood. But one thing was clear: this story was not over. Not by far. And those who had once called her broken would soon learn that being groundbound did not mean powerless. And those who doubted the human would learn that saying yes was only the beginning of something far greater than they ever imagined. The morning light poured into the palace like liquid gold, cascading, touching the high glass towers and glowing softly against the crystal arches. And in one of those towers, Princess Thalixa stood quietly by her window, watching the sky where other Zerelians flew freely, weaving through the air like dancers, while she remained on the ground, her wings still and small, behind her back. And though her face stayed calm, her thoughts twisted with emotion, because Elias Trent the human was still here, and she didn't know whether to be hopeful or afraid, because no one had ever stayed before. No one had ever looked at her and seen more than her broken wings. Okay. And yet here he was, asking questions, laughing at her dry jokes, telling stories about Earth with such wonder that she sometimes forgot who she was supposed to be. Sid. And as she turned from the window and made her way through the quiet halls toward the sky garden, she thought about how strange he was, how strange, and how honest. And when she reached the floating platform, surrounded by arching vines and glass blue flowers that shimmered in the air, Elias was already there, staring up at a Zerelian sculpture that floated above the garden. A statue of an ancient queen with wings that stretched out like shields. And he turned when he heard her footsteps, grinning like he always did, that crooked smile that never looked rehearsed, and said, "I was wondering if you'd forgotten about me." And Thalixa shook her head, her voice soft but steady, as she said, "I'm not the one who forgets." And he chuckled, stepping closer, then asked, "So where are you taking me today?" And she didn't answer right away, just walked past him to a hidden gate at the edge of the garden. A place most nobles ignored because it led down, rather than up, into the old parts of the palace where history was buried under silence. And Elias followed without hesitation, his eyes curious, steps light, even though he didn't have wings. Then as they moved through stone tunnels and past flickering light orbs that cast long shadows, he noticed the way the leaks are relaxed in these hidden places, as if the weight of royal eyes couldn't reach her hair. And finally, they reached a chamber with a domed ceiling and floating crystals that sang softly when touched. And she told him, this was the archive of unspoken things, a place where lost stories lived. Things not written in history, but whispered across time. And Elias, fascinated, asked her to show him her favorite story, and she led him to a crystal that glowed faintly and touched it. And it played a voice, hers, recorded long ago, reciting a poem she wrote as a child, full of sorrow and fire. And Elias listened quietly, then looked at her and said, "You've always been strong, haven't you?" And Talixa didn't answer, but her eyes said everything. And for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence filled only by the soft hum of the crystals, until footsteps echoed from the tunnel behind them, and they turned to see one of the emperor's high advisors stepping into the chamber, his long robe trailing like a shadow, and his voice was cold as he said, "Princess, you should not bring outsiders here." And Talixa replied calmly, "He is no outsider." But the advisor ignored her and faced Elias, saying, "Your presence here causes disruption. The people talk, the nobles grow uneasy, and the court cannot function on human sentiment." And Elias, standing firm, said, "Then maybe it's time they learned too." And though his voice was steady, he could feel the tension rise, because he knew this man had power, and power disliked to change. And after a few sharp words, the advisor left, but the message remained clear. Elias was not welcome by all. And Talixa saw the shadow that passed through Elias's eyes, but he pushed it aside and said, "So, what's next on the tour?" And she smiled, because even now, even with pressure rising, he chose to stay beside her. And that evening, at the official banquet held in the sky chamber above the city, where the walls were made of light and the floor shimmered like a lake, Elias was seated at the edge, away from the main table. Talixa sat beside her father, the emperor, who spoke little but watched much. And as nobles rose to toast ancient traditions, a tall noble from the war caste stood and said, "It is good to remember that our strength lies in the skies, not in the ground." And his eyes glanced toward Talixa before flicking to Elias, and the room fell into a strange silence, heavy with meaning. And Elias stood slowly, holding a glass of clear cerulean wine, and said, "Strength also lies in what does not fly, in what chooses to stand firm." And though his words were simple, they echoed in the chamber, drawing surprised looks from some, frowns from others, and the emperor only raised an eyebrow, then tapped his staff once, ending the discussion. And later, when the banquet was over, Elias and Talixa stood at the edge of the chamber, looking out at the stars, and she said, "You made enemies tonight." And he replied, "Then I'm in good company." And she laughed, quietly, the sound like wind through crystal leaves, and for a moment, all the pressure faded, all the doubts vanished, and it was just them, a human and a princess, standing side by side in a world that didn't know what to make of them. And as the stars wheeled overhead and the soft lights of the city glowed below, they both wondered, silently, what would happen next, because something had shifted. Not just between them, but in the empire itself, and neither of them could stop it now. The day began with a strange silence across the Zarelian palace, the kind that only came before something important, something heavy. And Princess Talixa felt it deep in her bones as she stood before the ancient chamber known as the Spire of Judgment, a towering hall carved from sky crystal that shimmered with blue light, and behind her walked Elias Trent, his steps steady, though his heart beat fast with unease, because today was the trial of wings, a test once meant for future rulers to prove their strength, courage, and purity of tradition, but now twisted by the court into something far more cruel. For though the Lixa had never been able to fly, the nobles demanded she face the trial to prove her worthiness as heir. And worse still, they insisted that Elias, as her chosen suitor, must face it with her to show whether he truly deserved a place beside her. And though it was meant to shame them, neither backed down, not even for a moment. And as they stepped into the chamber, with its high walls and watchers seated on floating balconies above, the emperor sat in the highest seat, his face unreadable, while advisors and nobles filled the air with whispers like rustling leaves, all eyes on the strange pair below the broken-winged princess and the earthbound human hand. Then the high speaker of the wings rose and declared the trial would begin, explaining that the couple must cross the path of ascent, a long, dangerous climb through a shifting gravity maze high above the palace, meant to be flown through by those with wings, but walked and climbed by no one in living memory. And even the Lexa's sharp breath could not be hidden when she heard this. But Elias only touched her hand gently, whispering, one step at a time, and they began walking together as the floor beneath them tilted, floated, and vanished in places, replaced by beams of light and wind currents that pushed and pulled in strange directions. And at first they moved carefully, holding on to the silver rails and timing their steps. But soon the path narrowed into thin bridges of energy, and every gust of wind threatened to knock them into the swirling mist below. And high above, the nobles watched in silence, some expecting failure, others hoping for it. And still, Elias pressed forward, using his arms to hold the Lixa steady when the winds grew wild. And she guided him where the pull of gravity changed, using her training to sense the shifts, and together they moved like parts of a single mind, never blaming, never hesitating, even when they slipped or stumbled. And near the center of the trial, a sudden challenge emerged, a ring of floating blades that spun slowly in the air, cut of an old defense system not used in centuries, but activated now to test them. And Elias frowned, then turned to the Lixa and said, "If you give me the timing, I'll go first." And she did, counting in the old tongue, her voice calm even as fear gripped her chest. And Elias moved through the blades, ducking and leaping, barely making it to the other side with a scrape across his arm, then turning and shouting, "Your turn." And she nodded, stepping into the danger with steady feet, her eyes focused, her movements graceful despite the pain in her legs. And when she reached him, breathless but unhurt, Elias pulled her into a brief, fierce hug before they moved on. And the end of the trial loomed just ahead, an open gap, wide and deep, with only a narrow path of light stretching across it, pulsing with unstable energy. And the Lixa stared at it, knowing her wings could never carry her, and walking across would be madness. But Elias stepped onto the beam without fear, holding out his hand, and said, "Trust me." And slowly she followed, her fingers wrapped tightly around his, every step a battle against gravity and fear, until at last they reached the other side, stumbling onto solid ground as the beam flickered and vanished behind them. And above, the nobles burst into loud, confused voices. Not cheers, not yet, but something close to shock, for no one had expected them to survive, let alone finish together. And the emperor raised his staff for silence, then stood, looking down at them with an unreadable gaze before speaking in a voice that filled the entire spire. "They have passed." And those three words echoed like thunder, shaking the court to its core. And though some nobles grumbled and turned away, others looked at Elias and the Lixa with something new in their eyes, respect, maybe even on later, as the two sat alone in the quiet garden, bruised and tired. Lixa looked at Elias and said, "They wanted to break us," and he smiled gently, replying, "Then we'll just keep giving them a reason to fail." And she leaned her head on his shoulder, the stars above spinning slowly, like they too were waiting to see what would come next. And though they both knew the court would not stop here, that more trials would come, more doubts would rise, they also knew this together. They had done what no one thought possible, and the story of the princess and the outsider had only just begun. Dark clouds gathered over the Zeralian capital as tension thickened in the air like smoke. And while the palace sparkled high above the floating city, danger stirred quietly in its shadows, for the trial of wings had changed everything. Princess Delixa and the human Elias Trent had done the impossible, proving their strength, their bond, and their right to stand together. But not everyone rejoiced, for in the hidden corners of the empire, voices whispered and plotted. Old nobles with sharp tongues and quiet hatred, warriors who believed tradition was being shattered, and secret factions who saw the union between a Zeralian royal and a human outsider as a threat to their control. And it began with small things: Elias's food poisoned but caught in time, the palace guards reassigned without warning, strange figures seen slipping through hidden tunnels at night, and though the emperor said little, his silence felt like a warning. And Thalixa, sharp-eyed and restless, began watching everything more closely, while Elias trained in secret with her old guard captain, learning to move like a soldier and think like a survivor, because he knew now that his place beside her would not be earned once, but every single day. And it wasn't long before the first real strike came, a sabotage in the Sky Archive that destroyed ancient records about early human-Zeralian contact, erasing proof that their species had once stood as allies. And Thalixa was furious, not just at the loss, but at the clear message left behind. Blood must not mix with dirt, etched in the wall with a blade of crystal fire. And that night, she summoned the High Council and demanded answers. But they gave her only polite smiles and vague promises, all while more eyes turned toward Elias, measuring him, waiting for him to fall. And still he stood by her, learning their customs, mastering their language, even facing her people with quiet courage at every public event. But nothing prepared them for what happened next. During a grand gathering meant to celebrate the day of Skybirth, as flying dances performed. High above the glowing towers, a blast echoed through the upper district, and screams followed as a transport pod carrying Zeralian civilians fell from the sky, exploding into flames on the lower platforms. And chaos erupted as more attacks followed, energy spikes, disabling power grids, sky bridges collapsing, and coded messages appearing across public screens declaring the empire must be cleansed. Though no one claimed responsibility, Lixa knew what this was. It was a coordinated strike by those who wanted to turn the people against her and Elias. And she was right, for within hours, a group calling themselves the Purity Flame sent a direct message to the palace, stating that unless the human was exiled and the royal line restored to its winged strength, more blood would be spilled. And the emperor, calm but stern, called for an emergency court session where nobles argued loudly, some calling for Elias's removal, others defending Thalixa, and still others warning of civil unrest. And through it all, Elias stood silently at Thalixa's side, refusing to flinch, even as he saw old enemies staring at him with hate. And when one general stepped forward and accused him of being the cause of the attacks, Elias spoke for the first time, his voice steady as he said, "You fear me because I don't belong to your past, I belong to your future." And the words struck like a blade, silencing the room for a moment before debate resumed with even more fury. But outside the palace, the city changed. Curfews were declared. Patrol ships filled the skies, and rumors of a possible coup spread like fire. And in the darkness of the lower platforms, a rebel base moved quickly, preparing another strike. Unaware that the Lixa had dispatched her most loyal spies to track them, Tay and that Elias, too, had begun working with trusted Zeralians who believed in unity, forming a hidden alliance they called the Circle of Flame's End, made up of both humans and Zeralians who believed peace was still possible. And after weeks of careful tracking, they discovered that the Purity Flame planned to attack the Temple of the First Flight, a sacred site where the Lixa was to give her official promise ceremony with Elias, an event meant to seal their union before the Empire and all its systems. And if the rebels succeeded there, it would destroy the hope of unity forever. So the two made a bold choice to go forward with the ceremony anyway, to stand in public with no shields, no walls, and dare the enemies to strike. And as the day arrived, the temple rose high into the clouds, its golden towers gleaming in the sun, and the crowds gathered below, many silent, many unsure, all watching as the Lixa stepped forward in her royal armor of light, and Elias beside her in traditional robes gifted to him by the sky priests. In the moment they joined hands before the ancient flame, the world seemed to hold its breath, and then it happened. 3 shadow ships broke from the clouds, dark and fast, weapons charged, speeding toward the temple. But this time, the circle was ready, and hidden cannons activated from within the nearby cliffs, shooting down 2 of the ships in a flash of lightning, while the third crashed into the lower wall, scattering attackers who leaped out with blades and bombs. But Elias didn't run, and neither did the Leaks. They moved like fire through smoke, backed by their allies, driving back the enemy inch by inch. And when one rebel lunged for the Lixa with a cry of rage, Elias stepped in front of her, took the blow to his shoulder, and still stood long enough to strike the attacker down. And as blood soaked his robe, the Lixa caught him, shouting for medics, her voice trembling for the first time. But Elias only smiled weakly and said, "Did we win?" And she whispered, "Yes, because they had." For even though the enemies had struck, the people had seen who stood to protect them, who came to destroy. And that night, the emperor made a rare public speech, declaring the Purity Flame broken in the union between his daughter and the human blessed by fire and sky. And while danger still lurked in hidden corners, the worst had passed. And the Empire had seen the truth with its own. Islias Trent was not just a human, not just an outsider. He was a warrior, protector, and the chosen of the princess, who never gave up. And the path ahead, though steep, now shone with a new light above the highest spire of the Zeralian capital, where clouds danced with light and stars peeked through the fading blue of dusk. The temple of eternal echo stood glowing like a jewel in the sky. And within its heart, Princess Lixa stood before the sacred altar of starlight, her silver robes flowing like water, wings folded neatly at her back, face calm, but her eyes burning with something fierce and new. And beside her stood Elias Trent, dressed in deep blue ceremonial garb, lined with gold thread, the wound on his shoulder now healed, though the memory of the attack still lived in every scarred wall of the city. Yet the people had chosen peace, had risen after the storm, and now they gathered far below on the lower platforms and towers, watching the grand ceremony broadcast across every screen. A moment no one believed would ever come, the true union of 2 souls from 2 worlds. And as the final night settled in, the ancient sky bells began to ring, deep and slow, marking the moment when promises made were not just for a lifetime, but for every breath after. And yet, behind the glow of celebration, there was still tension. For some feared the peace was too fresh, too fragile, and many whispered that someone would try to stop this day, just as others had tried to stop every step before. And the Lixa knew this fear, but she did not let it touch her voice when she began to speak, declaring her vows before the Empire. Her voice strong as she spoke of courage, of standing beside someone not because it was easy, but because it was right, of choosing unity in a world that often demanded division. And Elias, taking her hands, spoke his vows in the old tongue he had worked so hard to learn, and his words, though simple, held weight. He promised to honor not just her, but her people, her burdens, her skies, and to never step back. Not even when the world turned cold, and, as the final vow passed between them, a beam of starlight pierced through the ceiling of the temple, a rare cosmic alignment said to bless only the truest unions. And the crowd below gasped in awe. Yet, just as the final bell rang, a sharp sound cut through the peace of strange buzzing. Too fast, too precise, and the Lexus guards moved at once, surrounding the couple as a rogue drone, sleek and black, burst from behind the temple wall, darting toward the altar with a red core blinking. And in that split second, Elias moved faster than anyone expected, pushing Talixa aside and shielding her as the drone exploded in a flare of smoke and sound, throwing them both to the ground. But the protective barrier had caught most of the blast, and within seconds, the guards secured the area, capturing a shadowed figure trying to flee across the temple rooftop. Another desperate attempt by the last fragments of the purity flame, but this time they had failed, not just in action, but in spirit, for the people had seen everything: how Elis protected their princess, how she refused to leave his side, even when danger struck again. And when the smoke cleared, the two stood together once more, slightly bruised, slightly shaken, but holding hands, unbroken. And the high speaker stepped forward then, not delaying the ceremony, but completing it, placing the crown of vows upon their joined hands, sealing their union not only by law or blood, but by fire, trust, and choice. And the cheers that rose from below shook the spires, filling the air with light as ships lit their engines and circled the temple in glowing formation, while across the stars, human colonies sent messages of peace, and Zarelian outposts replied with songs of unity. For what had once seemed a strange marriage of weakness now stood as the strongest symbol the galaxy had seen in ages. And that night, after the final words had been spoken and the last guests had left, Talixa and Elias stood alone at the highest point of the palace, watching the stars spin slowly overhead. And Elias whispered, "Do you think they'll ever stop trying to tear us apart?" And Talixa, resting her head against his, replied, "Let them try. We've already shown them we'll always rise." And for the first time in what felt like forever, the night was quiet, not because danger was gone, but because love had made them stronger than it, and far beyond the sky. In the uncharted zones where new stars were born, a message was sent, an invitation, signed by both human and Zarelian leaders, offering peace to distant civilizations who still lived in fear. And at the bottom of that message, one simple line read, "We are stronger together." And so, the story of the disabled alien princess and the human who said yes did not end in fire or sorrow, in stars, in silence, in vows whispered beyond worlds, in the union that changed the future forever.